Okay, so what I'll do is, as Koei mentioned, I'll go over some of the aspects of the new data sharing mandates from NIH. So again, this policy became effective January 25th of this year, and sort of the highlight points is that all data must be managed, most data should be shared, and this data should be shared as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And so, this applies to all NIH research. So it's different than past policies that had limits on, what grant activities the data sharing mandates were required for. And this is also now a new plan. So it's now a data management and sharing plan. As I mentioned, the effective date was January 25th, so anything being submitted now falls under the new policy. And the policy does define, for example, what it considers to be data. And so this is, the actual material data that is of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings. And it's regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications, and that's a key difference as well. So in the past, some journals have required sharing of data, for example, when you want to publish a paper with them. This new policy, states that, that the data that is generated as part of an NIH-funded study, regardless of whether it ends up in a publication, should be shared. And they also define what they don't consider to be data. And so this is things like, your laboratory notebook, preliminary analysis, case report forms, drafts of scientific papers, plans for future research, and so on. So this is all specified within the policy itself. But again, the key thing is that scientific data that is not used to support a publication, are still considered scientific data that falls under the policy. They also define when data should be made accessible. So there are two aspects to this. The first is that it should be made accessible no later than the time of an associated publication. So this is, if you have data that supports a publication, that should also be shared, or published, at the time that that publication comes out. Or if data is not associated with a publication, it should be made available at the end of the award support period. So this is sort of, how they are defining when data should be shared. They encourage use of established repositories to the extent possible to make your data available. And so there's, a number of lists out there that describe, NIH supported repositories that exist out there for the sharing of data. And NIH encourages that these practices are consistent with the FAIR principles. I'll touch on that in a second. One other notable change is the funding aspect. So normally with NIH awards, you can only spend money in your current fiscal year to things that are applied in that fiscal year. For the data management and sharing plan, they do allow for the spending of funds on long-term data preservation. So data preservation that will basically take place after the fiscal year that it's paid in, and that is allowable under the new data management sharing plan rules. And then they also state that there could be repercussions for non-compliance, and so that's important to remember. Now, one aspect of the data sharing data publication is that in the community itself, of journals, people working on the publication of data, the repositories, there is a notion of data becoming a research product, just like a publication, so that data should be considered a legitimate citable product of research. And so there was a group, Force 11, which brings together, journals, researchers, librarians. They uh, put forth a joint declaration of data citation principles that is being sort of implemented, in the community so that one can cite data sets just like other published literature. And so here's an example from another repository, that we run, and so a data citation looks, just like a regular citation for a manuscript, where you have the title, you have the authors, you have an abstract, and then you have the DOI, the digital object identifier. So this is the same identifier same type of identifier that publications receive as well. And then, this can then also be found through, a Google data set and other areas where, they're tracking citations. Now, so one of the things that NIH did with their, new policy is that they did add sort of data management to the plan. And that's a key aspect of ensuring, that you'll be able to publish the data, at the end of a study in a more easy way, in the sense that, if your data management practices are fairly ad hoc, as you're, doing your experiment, you finish your experiment, by the time you get to the time of publication for that data, the question then becomes, did you have all the metadata that was required? Is the data in a format that a repository can accept this data? And so at the end of the study, when you come to a publication of that data, you may have a lot of work to do, to get it in shape, to make it available through a repository. And so that's why having good data management plans and good data management practices helps with preparing that data, making sure that from the start, appropriate metadata is being collected, and the data is in proper formats, so that, by the time you get, again, to the end of the study, the data is in much better shape, to be made available through a repository. And, these good data management practices, aren't just, for publication. Mostly they help, the lab. They help you in terms of, being able to reuse that data, and also, share that data, for example, with close collaborators as well. So, I've heard from, a number of people that they've never, regretted annotating too much, right? It's always an issue with data if there aren't enough annotations to make sense of what is in the data. And having good data management practices allows reuse within the lab. For example, if, new postdocs, new graduate students come in, and you want to, get them started on some, for example, data that was collected previously, or, for example, if you're collecting data from similar cohorts, over a longer time period through different studies, being able to potentially aggregate that data as well is further enabled by good data management. And so NIH encourages data management and data sharing practices consistent with FAIR. And most people may know what FAIR is, but basically there are high-level principles to ensure that the data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this is for humans and also for machines. So, we've been hearing a lot about AI, ML techniques, to be able to apply those techniques to data. The data must be, in proper formats, and have, the required metadata to be used, by these routines. And so when one looks at, these four principles, the findable, again, I mentioned the DOI. These are things that are provided by an appropriate repository. So they'll give you, the globally unique persistent identifier. They'll make sure that the metadata is associated with the data. They'll have protocols for, authentication, authorization if necessary, and also for access to the data. The FNA and FAIR are really, taken care of by, the repository, that is holding the data. The interoperable and reusable really gets back to good metadata, right? To make sure that the data is well described and of appropriate formats, so that other researchers are able to get in and reuse that data. And again, we're moving from the resource sharing plan to the data management and sharing plan. So again, this is a new document. One key thing is that this is not part of review. So the resource sharing plan still exists and is for resource sharing as it always has been. It's just the data piece that has been moved out and into this data management and sharing plan. And again, that is not part of review, so reviewers will not see that during the review of applications. And it is something that if an award is funded, that will become then a discussion with you and the program officer, and that will be something that will be agreed to, in terms of any modifications or updates, to the DMSP. Now, in terms of the DMSP itself, there are a number of required elements, and I'll go through them briefly. The first is data type, and here, what they want described is basically, the type of data being collected, and most critically, the amount and the size of that data. Description of any degree of data processing, that is done to the data, for example, before it's received, or in terms of any, normalization of the data in terms of what data is going to be made available, right? So if the raw data may not be useful to be made available, but the data that has been reconstructed and normalized is what is most useful to be shared. That should be stated as to the data that's being collected and what will be shared. And they also want a brief listing of the metadata associated with that. They also have a section on standards. So what are the data formats, for example, that are going to be used in terms of sharing, making this data available? And that is important, as closed formats, for example, if you're using, some equipment from a specific vendor, and they have a closed format as the data comes off the instrument, is that, how usable is that going to be for other researchers? So, are you converting that to open formats? They also want information on standards, in terms of, are there any identifiers, that you're going to be using, any use of ontologies, or control terminologies, other data documentation in terms of, are there any standard quality assurance control measures that are being applied to the data? And we all know that when you have standards, there's always a ability to create new standards. So the key thing here is there are a number of standards, open data formats that are out there, and so reuse is, of course, best practice. In terms of determining what standards to use, this is something that becomes important when you're looking at repositories that you may want to share or publish your data with. And so repositories often enforce specific standards for metadata and data. And so through our repository finder webpage, we do link out to fairsharing.org, which is a good resource that maintains information on database standards and policies across biomedicine. And so they will have a listing of standards that databases use. So this is something that might be useful when looking at repositories that you will be depositing data in. And then there's a description of related tools. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're using closed formats or formats that are not sort of open standards, are there any specialized tools that are needed to access or manipulate the data? How can these tools be accessed? And, are these tools going to remain available, for, the time period that the data will remain available? And so again, this is a description of what is required to access the data. There's also a listing. So there's other qualifications within uh, the description of the DMSP, and so here they also describe other areas where they might want some additional information. So are there any custom workflows or pipelines that were developed that are necessary to analyze or process the data? So again, getting to the issue of replication, being able to describe the software tools and tooling that was used to process the data and get it into a state necessary for use. There's then the section on data preservation, where you basically will describe, the repositories where you will be depositing the data, how the data will be findable and identifiable. And again, if this is going into a domain-specific repository or one of the generalist repositories, they will be the ones, who will be making the data findable and identifiable. So that's fairly straightforward, to answer. And then a description of the timeline. So as I mentioned before, data is made available, should be made available at time of publication. So here describing, based on what's described in the proposal, when you see data being made available, if there are any potential changes in terms of making data available at time of publication, anything that you could see modifying that timeline, those requirements, you should make sure to discuss that in this section. And again, I think the biggest lesson in terms of data management, data standards, getting ready to share, is think about where your data will end up in the beginning. So if you do that, and that's why this data management sharing plan is very helpful, is that you're already starting to think through how the data must be formatted, structured to get into that repository, so you can make sure that over the life of the the award, that good data management practices are assisting sort of your preparedness for making that data available. And as I mentioned, we do have at dkNET, we do have a listing of repositories. So this is something that we've put together, in consultation with our NIDDK program team. And so it lists repositories, provides links to their upload, download pages. If there are potential costs and we know about them, we'll also provide some information on that. And we also, again, link out to fair sharing about these repositories. There is another section on access, distribution, and reuse considerations. And this is a section where important information about informed consent, any privacy or confidentiality protections with the data, if there are any other restrictions, imposed by, federal, tribal, state laws, or any other regulations, policies. So again, this is a critical section for you to describe any potential issues with the sharing of data. If data has to be made available through controlled environments. So for example, the NIDDK central repository is a place where human subjects data can be made available, and they have the appropriate review mechanisms, to allow researchers to request access to data and get the appropriate approvals for that. So describing, any of the issues with potential distribution or reuse of the data should be documented here. And it's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that this is going to be a review by your program, reviewed by your program officer, but also it can be begin a discussion with your program officer about some of the issues that you see, with publication of data and things that should be taken into account. And then I just wanted to mention there are tools now being refined and developed. So there is the DMP tool, which is something made available by, I believe it's the California Digital Library, and they have, had this tool for a while where they, help people, fill out their resource sharing plans, but they've now, updated this to add the DMSP as well. And so again, these tools help you sort of walk through the creation of DMSP, and they are something that you can look at. And again, we have these links to these resources through our data management information pages. And so again, as as I pointed out, the DMSP helps you plan ahead. It important aspect is also helps you start thinking about cost. And by cost, it's not just the cost of putting the data in a repository, right? So the cost for the DMSP can also be associated with any curatorial work, any work on your end, that is necessary to make the data, to format the data properly and to get it submitted to a repository, right? So that's time and effort, on your end, from a graduate student, postdoc, data wrangler, whatever you might have, in the lab, who would be working on this, those costs can also be included. And again, the sections on use of standards, use of open formats, all of that in terms of getting the data ready, from the get-go, can help lower costs, because again, at the end of a study, it becomes very difficult sometimes to have to go back and reformat everything and find metadata. So the earlier one starts in terms of planning for this, the better. And so I know there many people are feeling overwhelmed with these new requirements. But again, there is a sharing of responsibility, right? So the repositories and registries where data end up, they do play a role to support many of the activities. For the researchers, really, as I've been mentioning multiple times, good data management and preparing to share from the beginning are critical, right? Because that makes your life easier, as you work towards submitting to a repository. And then, projects such as dkNET that are there, so we're here to try and help researchers, meet these mandates. We, have a helpline. We provide information online as well. So if you have any questions about, for example, where data from a research study, might end up, and you're not quite sure, you can always contact our help desk, and we'll try to help you as much as we can. And so again, we do have that whole section on the website. So come take a look. So we document a bunch of information. So for example, this is the first page you get dropped into. On the right of the page, we've been collecting, all the policy links and, links to the NIH sharing web pages. And on the left side, we have other links to useful resources such as the DMP tool, and other information as well. One thing that we're coming out with soon is a repository wizard that will ask you some questions to sort of narrow down repositories that would be appropriate, for your data. And so that's something we will be releasing later this year. And as Koei said, get in touch with us, and we're here to help. So thank you for this quick overview, and now we can get into any questions people might have.